Over the course of nearly 3.5 decades, Final Fantasy has published nearly 2 dozen main games, spawned multiple sequels, created countless ancillary games, published multiple movies, helped save a company, and revitalized the genre. It is also one of the worst named games of all time. Seriously, it is not a Final Fantasy, like at all. Nothing about Final Fantasy is final. In fact, the whole series may never die. All of this leads us back to a very good question. One I think my mom first asked me in the 1990s. Why the hell is Final Fantasy called Final Fantasy? The answer is actually kind of sweet, and it ties back to the story of Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of the Final Fantasy series. Sakaguchi was born in November 1962 and grew up in the Japanese city of Hitachi. He showed an interest in music at a young age, formed a band with his friends, and wanted to be a musician. However, in college, his plans changed. Sakaguchi showed a real interest in games and grew up playing Wizardy, an early role playing game that was available on the Apple II. This text based RPG helped to influence Sakaguchi to want to learn how to program computer games on his own, and he would major in computer science while attending Yokohama National University. The problem for Sakaguchi? Computers were expensive, and he needed a part time job to afford an Apple II and other games. So he got a job at this little game company called Square. At the time, Square was a subsidiary of Denyu Shaw, an electronic power company in the area. Now again, keep in mind that this was only meant to be a part-time job, designed to put a few yen in Sakaguchi's pocket while he attended college. He had no plans on doing this full-time, or even as a career. Sakaguchi still dreamed of becoming a musician. The thing was, he was actually pretty good at computer programming. Sakaguchi first worked on 2 games. The first, Torn InGen, was a game version of a popular television show. The next was The Death Trap, a text-based adventure game with limited graphical feedback. The game was described as being a Cold War spy thriller. The Death Trap would prove pivotal for Square. It was one of their first games, and it was the first that Sakaguchi was appointed a programmer as. Now, just to reiterate, Sakaguchi was still a college student with an in-progress education, but he wound up being credited as a producer on the game, and he worked on its sequel, Will the Death Trap 2. That game was even more successful, and sold 100,000 copies in Japan. Now an established programmer and video game producer, Sakaguchi took his career to the next level, staying with Square when the company became independent in 1986 and taking a leave from college. Sakaguchi was appointed the company's director of planning and development, taking a lead role in other Square games like King's Knight for the NES. Yet, Sakaguchi wasn't happy. The games he was working on were action-oriented, and he didn't enjoy these games. Sakaguchi earned a bad reputation as someone who was, quote, difficult to work with, something he would attribute to just hating the games. In 1986, the video game world would change with the publication of Dragon Quest, which was titled Dragon Warrior in North America. The game featured many classic RPG elements that we take for granted today. You play as a young hero who must defeat the evil Dragon Lord. Over the course of the game, you engage in numerous quests that strengthen your hero, battling enemies to increase your level. The game was first responsible for implementing a variety of systems still used today, including leveling, hit points, magic points, and more. It was also a far more intricate plot than anything that had hit the market at that point. Sakaguchi would fall in love with the game and would fully understand its potential, later saying that Dragon Quest would form the foundation for much of what the Final Fantasy series became. Indeed, it was the success of Dragon Quest that led Sakaguchi to turn to RPGs. He approached Square higher-ups in 1986 and presented them with his own idea for a role-playing game, Fighting Fantasy. The plot was simple. The Warriors of Light, that's you, have to rescue Princess Sarah and save the world. However, the fantasy elements of the plot were new to video games, and drew heavily upon classic RPGs like Wizardy and Dungeons & Dragons for inspiration. Interestingly enough, according to interviews, only 3 people volunteered to work on Fighting Fantasy. Sakaguchi would describe this by saying, quote, basically this was my fault. My reputation in the company was that I was a rough boss, even though none of my games sold all that well. So they all went to Team B or Team C or whatever instead. Of course, there were many problems during the game development. Indeed, development struggled until its second half, when then other teams from Square, sensing the potential of Fighting Fantasy, helped to complete the game. Square also hired additional programmers, and soon enough, Fighting Fantasy was ready. Except for the name. See, the name was already taken. Fighting Fantasy was an RPG gamebook. And there was another consideration for Sakaguchi. Simply put, he was done. He was frustrated and exhausted. He had yet to achieve the success or satisfaction he was looking for in video game development. So, Sakaguchi came to a conclusion. This game was it. If it failed commercially, he was done. He'd go back to school. There were also marketing considerations to keep in mind. Sakaguchi wanted to keep the abbreviation of the game as FF, which was also easy to pronounce in Japanese. And one more thing, Square was going broke. During 1986 to 1987, the company was struggling financially. Square had published multiple games for the Famicom Disk System, a peripheral of the Nintendo, and these games had not been commercial successes. Furthermore, Square had high expenses, stemming in part from its expensive rents that came due to its office location in the Ginza district of Tokyo. All of this led to the name of the game. Sakaguchi was miserable and tired. His employer, Square, was going bankrupt and facing financial ruin. The game might be Square and Sakaguchi's last. It was his Final Fantasy. Of course, as we all know, it wasn't. Final Fantasy was revolutionary in many ways. It had a fantastical environment. It used a party-based system, it created groundbreaking music, and it first utilized a job system that created roles and required teammates to cooperate with each other to be successful. All these conventions are staples for today's video games. But in 1987, they were completely revolutionary. The public reacted accordingly. Final Fantasy was a major commercial hit. It put Square on the map as a major player in the video game scene, and it unquestionably saved the company from bankruptcy. Now, since its original 1987 release, the game has been remade, remastered, and re-released a very impressive 19 times, generating hundreds of millions for Square and permanently cementing Final Fantasy as one of the most impactful RPGs, if not video games, of all time. Of course, the success of Final Fantasy led to a massive pressure to produce a sequel, and that was done at lightning speed, with Final Fantasy II coming out 1 year, minus 1 day, after the premiere of the original game. Now, Final Fantasy II is a sequel to the original, but the truth is that these games are totally different. There are new characters, a new world, a new plot, a more advanced combat system, better graphics, and more. However, the game was never going to have a new name. The original Final Fantasy was too successful for that. Thus, a convention was born. The game, and every subsequent game, would be part of the Final Fantasy series. Subsequent games would continue to follow this pattern. And while there would be many thematic similarities across all the Final Fantasy games, including fighting against corrupt government, crystals, magic, character progression, chocobos, guys named Sid, and more, the games would all be wildly different. Indeed, it wasn't until the release of Final Fantasy X-2 in 2003 that Final Fantasy would first try a direct sequel, something that has only been repeated a limited number of times. Anyway, there's your answer. Had Final Fantasy been a commercial flop, it would have been the Final Fantasy for both Sakaguchi and Square. Instead, to the joy of millions of players, including me, and likely you, Final Fantasy was anything but a Final Fantasy. And that is it for this episode of Almost Something. If you like this video, as always, please do hit that subscribe and like button. It keeps the content fresh and keeps it going. And please keep watching us for more high-quality video game content. Have a wonderful day out there. Don't let there be any almost in your room. Take care, folks.